Excellent. Thank you, Tim. Before I get started, Tim or whomever, are my slides up and looking all right for everyone?
Okay.
Excellent. All right, so as Tim said, my name is Andy Krumm, and I'm joined by my colleague at the Carnegie Foundation, Alicia Grunow, and we're going to talk about using data for improvement. It's a broad topic, and it's one that we kind of think about as the black box. It's an old idea, and it's an old set of ideas where we have data, we have information, something magic happens, and then all of a sudden we have improved learning environments. And this perception that data will lead to learning and improvement is so pervasive that we have any number of names to help label this phenomenon, all the way stretching back to data-driven decision-making, a more ethnographic approach to the study of data use practices. Nowadays, in more modern guise, we think about it as data science or big data, learning analytics, research-based approaches, and educational data mining. So within this stew of labels, they're all pointing at this general idea that data will somehow magically drive improvement. And one of the things that Alicia and I are going to talk about, both through some examples and then through some different high-level thinking on this topic, is how we can be explicit about that process. How do we go from data that we're collecting? Why are we collecting it? How are we collecting it? And how do we leverage that in the service of improvement? Data doesn't drive, people do. And the bigger the data, not necessarily the better the driver. And what we want to do, again, over a couple of cases and then based on some of our experiences, is get explicit about how we can use data to drive improvement within learning environments. Now, one of the sort of nice, clear logic models for this comes from the work of Cynthia Coburn and Turner, 2011, who put together this nice logic model for one way in which we can understand the black box, where we have these interventions to promote data use, either from research or from policy, and they're going to hit an organization where there are routines and different degrees of access, different amounts of time, norms, prevailing power relationships, all of which are going to affect the ways in which data get used. And then there's going to be some processes for using those data. What do we notice? What interpretations do we draw from it? And then how do we construct implications? And this points to everything from who's at the table, what knowledge and experience are they bringing as they are looking at a data product together and deriving these implications. And all of this then is filtered into, the potential outcomes, whether we're shooting for organizational change, a change in a specific teaching practice or learning practice, as well as some kind of outcome related to student learning. So one reason we sort of highlight this logic model from the black box is it provides one illustration of how the system works, how we can start to think about data use. But then as you look at each one of these things that are in bold, interventions, context, processes, outcomes, you can see that it's actually a pretty brittle and pretty elongated process that stretches all the way from the intervention to the outcome. And so the simple idea that if we just collect the right data, we're going to improve, I think this figure here nicely illustrates that there's a lot of fragile points in that system. And ultimately, and the point that we're going to try and make clear today, is that it actually leaves unanswered the question of how to improve the system. So this logic model helps us know, what are the key parts if we're trying to leverage data to improve some learning environments in a local system. We should attend to our intervention. We should attend to the organization. We could attend to the processes that exist and what we're shooting for. But it doesn't tell us how we're going to go about, as a group of researchers, as a group of practitioners, to collectively intervene and use data to drive improvement on a goal that we've decided upon based on an understanding of the system that we've come to. So I wanted to sort of frame this a little bit that there are many moving parts when we think about using data for improvement, when we think about using data to improve learning environments and learning opportunities. And now what I'm going to do is turn it over to Alicia to highlight a couple of examples and ways of thinking about this, drawing on some specifics from a K-12 context. And then from there, I'll pick it back up and we can talk a little bit more and then open it up for questions that you might have. So with that, I will turn it over to Alicia.
All right. Good morning or afternoon to everyone. Quick check. Can you see the slides okay on my end? Those coming across?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. So just to pick off where Andy left off, one of the things I think is really important as we think about how to use measurement for improvement is to recognize that a measure is not a measure is not a measure, right? And so the purpose in an improvement context is to provide usable information for learning about how to improve your system. So in an improvement science context, we'll assume that improvement is a learning journey, and we're looking for measures as a really useful guide for us as we try to learn how to improve our system. And then this central purpose has a lot of implications for what kinds of measures that we collect and how they're used. So when we think about what's measured, the measures that we need to have to give us some good information about the actual work practices that we're trying to change. So whatever we're trying to change, we need the measures serve as a feedback measurement for us, a feedback mechanism for us as we're along the improvement journey. This also has implications for how and when we measure things, right? So if we're going to feed sort of an iterative learning journey and we're going to collect measures that are really closely tied to the work, this creates a problem for us in terms of data collection and feeding it back in a timely fashion so that it could actually sort of serve those learning loops that we envision for it to happen. So we need measures that can kind of come right out of the work and that can get fed back relatively quickly so that people can use them in the next iteration of learning. And finally, it has really important implications for the social context of how measures are used. So measurement is one of those, data in particular is one of those things that has been used in so many different ways that it's very, very easy to get people in a threatening mode, which is going to work against us in this whole learning to improve type of idea. So we have to be able to use the measures in a social context where we can socially together make meaning of them and that it's safe, psychologically safe to draw conclusions, try new ideas, have things not work, and use that as a learning opportunity to go forward. It turns out that education is not the first industry to try to bring improvement science into the fold. And one of the things that we have done for the last, 6-7 years at the Carnegie Foundation is try to understand a little bit about how improvement science took hold in different industries like healthcare and manufacturing and other social sector organizations. And this data problem is something that predictably every industry struggles with. And part of that is because there are rich traditions of how measurement has been developed, the purposes for which it's been developed, and how it's been used. And those things can be counter to what we're trying to improve. So there was a paper, and this paper was really focused on different kinds of measures. Some feedback. Are you guys getting feedback?
Yeah, folks. Thank you.
Is that better? We got it? Okay. So the Solberg et al. Paper that's cited at the bottom of this slide, they laid out a framework for thinking about how are measures differently when they're used in an improvement context versus an accountability context versus a research context. And, going into this, bringing improvement science into education, we have, and particularly lately, a relative explosion of the kind of measures that are available to us in education. But a lot of them have been developed under an accountability or a research paradigm, which is not a problem, except for that what it's going to do is they're going to be insufficient in some ways for what we want to do in improvement. And so I think that's something important to recognize. And it's not that we can't use some of the measures from an accountability or that have been developed under those sort of paradigms. They can be very useful to us in our ultimate measurement set for improvement, but I think what we'll find is that they're insufficient in a number of ways. So it's an interesting paper if you're interested in reading it. And then we did a follow-up one here at the Foundation that's listed up at the bottom about, the corollary of these different kinds of measures in education. So when you think about accountability, just to go briefly over it, in accountability, measures that are developed for an accountability purpose, the central question in an accountability paradigm is trying to sort out everybody on sort of the similar distribution. So we can see which schools or which teachers or which classrooms are performing at the sort of high end of the bell curve and which ones are at the low end of the bell curve. And what we tend to use in an accountability framework are end-of-the-line outcomes. And so we're tending to try to do sort of summative measures of performance so that we can put people on a single distribution and sort out the high performers from the low performers. And given that context, what will end up happening is we'll end up having less frequent data. We're going to worry a lot about that they're exactly perfectly valid measures, because what we're worried about, well, we're always worried about their valid measures, but that they're accurate, because that we're going to be using them for very high consequences. When we move over to an improvement, if we're trying to use those measures, what we'll find is that that end of the line doesn't give us that much information about what needs to be improved. And it doesn't give us that timely feedback information that helps guide the improvement efforts. So accountability measures are often useful for measuring the ultimate impact of a variety of improvement efforts, but they're insufficient for helping us learn along the way. If you switch over and you think about measures that have been developed for research purposes, there's a whole host of different kinds of research purposes. But if we just take one, for example, of where you're oftentimes trying to understand the relationships between very conceptual variables. So what do we know about, say, something like agency and self-efficacy, right? Trying to understand what are the relationships between those sort of specific conceptual variables. And what we'll end up doing on a regular basis here is collecting a lot of information in a few amount of time points, and so that we can actually sort of precisely measure various constructs. And those, again, I think are very useful, can be very sort of leveraged for improvement, but these sort of really lengthy surveys that oftentimes we think about when we think about research that are trying to measure something very precisely in that way are very impractical to administer in this sort of day-to-day workflow piece that we're imagining as it feeds back for improvement. And so there's some modifications that have to happen there in order to get there. I will say that a kind of research that's the sort of policy evaluation or even program evaluation sort of fits a little bit still in the middle. Still we have this problem that usually those are set up as one large test, as opposed to an improvement where we loop things into iterative learning cycles. So all of this to say is a measure is not a measure is not a measure. And what we want to do in improvement is start with this notion of what is it that we need feedback on, and then therefore what measures do we need in order to do that, as opposed to starting with the measures and saying, and now we'll use these measures for improvement. So when we're working on improvement, Amy set this up nicely, is what we believe about improvement is that we're going to actually try to change the system that is producing outcomes. So sometimes one of the first laws of improvement we'll talk about is that every system is designed to get exactly the results that it gets. So if we see a particular outcome in a school district or in a set of school districts, we want to start to see what is the system and how is it designed to produce that outcome. And so that's going to lead us to thinking about processes. And the organizational processes, which can be thought of as a variety of levels, are one of the main building blocks of systems. And so if we had, for example, in a developmental math program in a community college, we had an outcome of 5% success, so 5% of students completing developmental math in a community college. Then what we're going to start to say is, well, what is the system that is producing that 5% of success? And that will lead us to focus on some of the processes that are involved in that system. So we did actually some of this work at Carnegie in the Carnegie Math Pathways, and we focused on a whole number of processes in order to do this. But the idea being, just to give you an idea of what that would look like, is there was a problem cycle routine, which you can think of as an instructional process, an instructional routine, right? And so that was something that was worked on. And a different part of the community college, the registration system would be the registration process would be another place that you might actually target improvement efforts in order to try to move that outcome. We found that the first week of class, from sort of a cultural, psychological, social psychological standpoint, was really important. And so that was that. You could think of that whole first week as a process that you might target your interventions. The big idea being in improvement that by working on improving these processes is the way you work on improving the overall outcomes. So that's the big picture idea. And then the question becomes, well, what does that look like, and how do you do that? And so the I'll run through a case with you that of a group that's working in the charter group that's working down in Southern California. Their name is High Tech High. They're also part of Carnegie's Student Agency Improvement Community. And I won't be able to do their work justice, but I've simplified it slightly so we can kind of start to think about how do measures get used in an improvement context. So I give them all of the credit of the amazing work, and I'll take all the credit for anything that I don't get quite right. So, you know, the improvement problem that High Tech High was working on, they were, well, first of all, just to start, there are 13 schools, they have 5 high schools, 4 middle schools, 4 elementary schools on different campuses that are all in the Southern California area. They are committed to having a diverse population, an integrated population. They are driven by, importantly, a project-based pedagogy. So if you go in there, you'll see a lot of project-based learning, a lot of students engaging in really authentic projects. And what the problem that they had, which may not sound like a problem on first glance, is they do have 98% of their students that are graduating from high school and going on to college. So that's something they're very proud of, and it's a very high success rate. They have about 65% that go directly to 4-year colleges, and they have about 53% of boys of color that go directly on to 4-year colleges. And this actually ends up, for them, is a problem, that's too low of a number for them, and particularly the disparity between the boys of color and their white students that go on to 4-year colleges for a whole host of reasons that have to do with what we know about students that go through the community college or the 2-year college versus the 4-year college rate. And so question one in an improvement journey, and what we'll see is along this improvement journey, there's different questions that get asked at different times, and that drives the need for different data, right, and different kinds of data to answer different kinds of questions. And so one of the first questions I had to ask when they started going on to this journey is, well, of all of the things we could focus on in our system, right, we're going to assume that if we have too low of a 4-year college going rate, that it was a system that produced that too low college going rate. And so of all of the places that we could focus in the system, where do we focus? And so one of the things that they did in that vein was to start looking at data, right? And one of the things that becomes really interesting in where you're deciding where to focus your improvement efforts is looking at the variation in performance. And you can think about the variation performance on a variety of different levels, right? So here we have the variation across schools. So everyone on the bottom row there is a different school, and they can look at what is the different college going rates that of different schools. And you can see very quickly that there are some schools that have higher college going rates than others, right? So that gives us, you know, one clue of where to look or where we might need to focus our improvement efforts. Another thing that they started to look at is the variation among students. And they didn't actually start with this notion of boys of color, but through their data analysis, that was the gap that became evident. And they actually had a very interesting conversation about whether you focus your improvement effort then specifically on boys of color or on the graduation rate overall, which I think is a really interesting question in thinking about how do you address equities and that you see. But nonetheless, the important factor here being they used data to try to figure out where is it that we have to focus, and ended up deciding to focus on specifically on boys of color. Another kind of data that they looked at, and this is another very powerful way to see systems, is they went out to talk to their users. They went out to talk to the boys of color and to try to learn from their experiences. And some of the things that came out in these empathy interviews really sort of stuck with them and became key design principles as they move forward, right? So this notion that getting through college is harder than getting into college helped them reframe what they were thinking about. And then I still feel like a fraud every day, I think was a phrase that everyone who's working on this improvement effort, it really sticks with them, and it becomes like a centralized force of what they're trying to solve. Another way to see the system, right? So first we have data. Second, we have the empathy interviews going to the user. The user can help you see the system in new light. It's actually start to map out the system. And this is what you have here is just a very simplified sort of process map or flow diagram of, if you think about the pathway of, you know, even if we started somewhere in high school and all the way to graduating from college, that it could break down at a whole number of joints, right? So just to be able to actually visualize first, what is the pathway, what are all the different things that you have to go through in order to be successful, and then we can start looking at the places that it breaks, right? So some of the things I discovered through doing this is there was a bunch of summer melt in that go to college one, right? So there would be people accepted to college when they were leaving school, and then summer somehow they wouldn't be enrolled in college in the fall. So that gives you a clue of where you might target improvement efforts. The applying and completing to FAFSA, that was one of the areas where, even though they had processes for everybody to go through that, it's one of the places that the differential in rates came up. So boys of color differentially didn't complete that stats as much as others. So that gives us a very concrete place where we can actually work on an equity issue. And then another place where they saw a big equity issue was in this ninth grade, passing ninth grade. So they had, like many schools do, a DF list, and disproportionate number of boys of color were on that DF list in ninth grade. And they knew that ninth grade, how well you did in ninth grade predicted how well whether they finished school. So that became another area that they could actually concretely work on the equity issue that they had identified. So, through this and a variety of other processes, including like scanning the literature and trying to figure out other organizations that had success, they came up with a driver diagram, which is a tool that we use in improvement to explicate our theory of improvement. So our theory of of all of the things we could focus on, where are the concrete things that we need to focus on in order to actually get to our outcome. So their outcome was to increase the number of underrepresented students who graduate college, career, and civic ready. That was their massive one, right? And they had broken that down into different measures that they could track. And then they thought, okay, well, if their theory, based on all of their learning about their system, said, well, we got to focus on the awareness, the pathway through to college and career. The family came up, a big one that came out of their empathy interviews. Their academic preparation and eligibility, so that ninth grade would fit in there, and the sort of learning mindset, which also came, and they also looped into there that idea of belonging that had come up also in the student interviews, right, about I still feel like a fraud every day. So their theory then was we need to make movements in each one of these areas or changes in each one of these areas to ultimately get to our aim. So, if you stop here, and this is sort of the crux of where improvement comes in, and I don't know that it's so uncommon that we would get to a place where we say, I'm not sure we always go in and we investigate the system quite as detailed as what I just described, but we do often get to a place where we think we know how to improve the problem. And the difference with improvement really comes is usually what we would do there is maybe we would send people to PD and we would train them how to do these things, or we would design a program and we would roll it out. And in improvement, what we're going to do instead is we're going to assume that we don't actually know how to move all of these things. And so we're going to try to learn our way into improvement. And one of the big things we're going to do is whoever processes we're trying to improve, right, whoever we think owns the processes that we're trying to improve, they are going to be the ones who are actively engaged in trying to figure out how to improve those. And that different way of going about it is what's going to drive the need for a different kind of measurement. Because if we had sort of a program design, we could do sort of a typical program evaluation where we could kind of design all of the changes and we could upfront, instead of thinking about this as a theory, we could think about it as a logic model, and then we could design the measures we wanted to do and collect them throughout. And here we're going to take a little bit more of an evolutionary route to trying to figure out how to improve. So 3 of the places that they started to work, right, so at some point you got to put a stake in the ground, you got to get to work, was the college application process. So they had a high school that really worked on that piece and trying to improve that. The transition to 9th grade, in particular that DF list that I was telling you about, and eventually they started to work on chronic absenteeism. So those are just 3 starting places. They didn't think that was going to get them all the way there, but it gave them a place to actually get started in improvement. And then we have this question is, and once we're in this phase, we've got a place to focus. Here's where the measurement really is trying to help us think about, are these changes actually an improvement? So up until this point, we've been trying to use measurement to say, well, to understand the variation and to try to figure out where is it that we should focus our improvement efforts. And then once we've decided where to focus and we're rolling along trying to learn to improve, we have to have, measurement has to help us figure out how do we make these changes, how do we know if these changes are actually an improvement. So I'll give you a story of one of their projects, and then we can kind of think back then if this is what they were working on, what would measurement look like? One of the first projects that they worked on was what they called Project Zero. And so they believed it was possible to get 100% of their ninth graders to pass all classes. So nobody's going to fail in ninth grade. So they're trying to get rid of that DNF list. And, you know, they had a group of, I think they were middle school, they must have been ninth grade, so they were of ninth grade teachers that were really trying to figure this out. And some of their early ideas were really around noticing when a student hadn't turned in their homework for a couple of days, because the homework, they kind of started to focus on homework as one of the key reasons that you don't pass ninth grade. So what they did was when the student hadn't completed their homework for a couple of days, that served as sort of a trigger, and they'd try to design a conference that really helped the students sort of get back on track. So they tried this on a small scale with a student, with another student, and you know that it wasn't. And what they were using for measures at that point, right, was the number of students on the DF list, and more proximally, the homework completion rate. So can we get the homework completion rates up, and then can that later impact the ninth grade passing rates, especially on that DF list? And they were rolling right along, and one day what happened? The problem with these conferences, by the way, is that they take a lot of time. So if you have like a lot of students who are missing homework a couple of times, then how do you have the time from the teacher's perspective to sit down with each of these students? And one of the things that as they were trying to test this on a small scale, is that one of the teachers was talking to a student one day, and the student quickly jotted something down on their hand, like wrote it right down on the palm of their hand. And the teacher was like, well, what are you writing down? He's like, oh, that's where I keep my homework, is on your hand. And the teacher was like, oh, wow, started to wonder about that. So the next day in class, they did a quick poll of, well, how many of you, how the students actually track their homework? And they found out that very few students had any kind of system for tracking their homework. And so but yet they had given all of the students planners. So that was something you get in ninth grade, was planners. But those planners weren't being used in such a way that were helpful for the students to track their homework. So long story short, what they ended up doing was putting in a little time at the end of the day where you would write in your planner, a very micro level change, what your homework was at the end of each period. And lo and behold, it really increased the homework completion rates of the students in a really remarkable way. And so they didn't actually have to go through all of these conferences, right? They had a fairly micro level change that made a big impact. But then when they started to look at how that impacted how well students were doing in their classes, it turned out that it wasn't closing that gap in terms of the boys of color that were on that DF list. So they had made an improvement in homework, but that hadn't produced a decrease in what they were after, right? And that was really important learning, actually, that wasn't what was driving it, because now they knew that that wasn't actually the problem. And what they started working on then was some support groups around boys of color, and were able to see actually a much bigger impact from that, right, in terms of how well that impacted their grades and their sense of belonging, which they also measured as well. In a similar vein, so that's one story, and it's powerful in the sense of one of the things that measurement's doing for us in improvement is it's helping us see when our theory isn't right and when we need to pivot to the next thing, right? And so we want to do that as quickly as possible. So we want to learn as quickly as possible. So we don't want to design something that makes a learning loop that's too slow. In parallel, a different group was working, different schools were working on chronic absenteeism. And actually, through some data digging, they learned, they had done a lot of correlations between attendance. And this was a couple of years ago. I think chronic absenteeism now is getting a lot more attention. But they had done correlations between attendance and grades and hadn't seen anything. But then as they dug deeper into the data, they had noticed that there was a certain number of absences that actually predicted that you wouldn't do very well in your class. And then they started to look at that. And in a similar way, this is a control chart that's often used in improvement. It's a P chart, and they looked at the chronic absenteeism by school. And you can see here what the lines will tell you is that we would expect statistically that the schools would lie between that upper and lower limit, which is what those are. Which will go into how those are calculated at a different time. And they saw there that, okay, so it varied across schools a little bit, but sort of within what would be expected. But there were some schools there that had really low levels of chronic absenteeism. And so they started to kind of go in and look and see what was in place. It turned out that one of those schools had what we might call an improvement, a chronic absenteeism bundle. So they had a set of changes that they had put in place that they had been working on in order to deal with chronic absenteeism. Whenever they talk about this, which I really respect, they always talk about their first strategy for reducing chronic absenteeism is making sure that the coursework is really engaging, right? So that's something that's central to their course, so they always start with that. But then, in addition to that, the school had developed this way of they had a routine for reviewing the data, and then when they got 5 absences, the students got a letter home, and then when there was 10 absences, they got a supportive family conversation. So the school had tried this, and here was, I think this is High Tech High North Campus. They used data in this case to say, well, is this bundle actually reducing chronic absenteeism? So they had, here's their graph from 2010 to 2016, and you can see that when they implemented it in 2012, after that, they actually saw a decrease in chronic absenteeism, which is pretty impressive, right? So it went down from a little bit over 15% to around 7 or 8%. Now, this started to build their degree of belief that maybe this change is an improvement. But, it wasn't like sort of a randomized control. It's not real, it wasn't designed to have that sort of causal evidence. Although, now you're starting to say, okay, well, I'm starting to be interested in what the school is doing. But one of the ways that we build evidence in improvement is through replication. So, once the school figured this thing out, there was a lot of schools who were very activated and were ready to actually say, hey, I'm really interested in what you're doing. And so here you have the High Tech High International at the top. They started the bundle in 2014 along with the middle school, and both of them saw big decreases in chronic absenteeism as well. And in a lot of ways, that's some pretty good, starting to get towards a higher degree of belief that it's actually this bundle that might be causing the chronic absenteeism to go down, because we've seen it happen replicated across 3 different sites. So, long story short, what we're doing in this dynamic of trying to decide which changes are improvement is we're trying to inform this theory that we're articulating, and we're constantly coming back to this theory and changing it, right? So we started with saying this is what we think, and then we use measurement to give us feedback on that theory, so we can kind of get rid of some of the changes that don't seem to work, and we can add some, right? So here you might think of, here they had a bundle for chronic absenteeism. I didn't talk about their college application process, but they had a similar sort of set of changes for college application. And then in 9th grade, they started learning different things about what are the changes that you need specifically around that piece of it. So the measures that they have, and the slide that I skipped briefly earlier is, in improvement, what we tend to think about is 3 kinds of measures. And we have outcome measures, which are there on the left-hand side here, which are going to measure ultimately what we're trying to accomplish. And these are things that are usually available to us. These are things we measure in accountability framework, so they're things that are already ready. Then we have these things called process measures. And these are things that are not always as available. I think more and more we start to collect these things, but these are more at the level of the process, right? So the college application process, or the absenteeism piece. Once you get down to something like the bundle around the chronic absenteeism, you probably would have a measure around how reliably that bundle gets implemented, because we would know that if it doesn't get reliably implemented, we wouldn't expect it to have the impact. And then sometimes you'll have what is in the middle here is these intermediary outcome measures. And those are things we often don't have as well, right? So, for example, at the bottom there, the learning mindsets. We had a quick survey that students could take in 3 minutes to see, okay, what do we know about the sort of social emotional factors that impact learning? So zooming back, so three sort of big points or notes. One, that when we think about data for improvement, we're thinking about data differently based on what questions we need to ask, which come from where we're at an improvement journey. Second of all, the measures that need to be collected and fed back are dependent on theory of improvement. And what we primarily use them for is to evolve and improve our theory of improvement. And then thirdly, and this is a big piece about the sort of rhythm of the measurement, is that we approach improvement as an iterative learning process. So we need frequent and quick learning loops so we can really accelerate our learning. And the measurement is a big piece of those frequent learning loops. So with that, I will pass it back over And I don't know if we want to pause for any questions or if we want to go through and then get all the big questions. Andy, whichever you prefer.
I just have a few, and I wonder if we can bundle them all together here toward the end.
Okay, great.
So building off of what Alicia was talking about, wanted to introduce a couple of ideas to set a different kind of framework for thinking about the work of using data for improvement. And it's a label that we've been developing and playing around with here at SRI, largely based on some support from the National Science Foundation, along with a bunch of other funders. And the general idea is, in this role as researchers, which many on the call are, and practitioners being in separate organizations, the goal of this endeavor has been to answer this question, like, so how can researchers and practitioners work together to develop data products, so these measures that Alicia was talking about, and then change ideas. So data doesn't do anything. Data is not a self-enacting resource. It is a support for change. So how do we then use those to develop change ideas that ultimately support more equitable and effective learning environments? So how can we bring people together? And within that question, there's this general idea of what needs to be in place, and then what does the overall process look like? So Alicia highlighted through that example some key steps along the way, and what we wanted to do is sort of put a smooth transition to the steps and what it can look like for you as a researcher as you are working with and doing some of this problem-solving work with practitioners. So across a bunch of projects, long story short, we found that there's 4 key things that need to be in place in order to even get to the place where Alicia was talking about, where people are using information to better understand the system and to take strategic action. And those 4 things that we found have been trust. So if there isn't some sense of personal regard, respect, belief in the other person's actions, reflecting their intentions, that if that isn't in place, that there will be a lot of difficulty in using data. Alicia referred to that as psychological safety earlier on at the beginning of her remarks, and that is a really key component to this. In some ways, what you do with that information, how you interpret it, is going to be based on who is in the room and how one feels both safe and what their motivations are when we're looking at those data. And another driver is an improvement method. Now, there's a lot out there. There's the model for improvement, which the Carnegie Foundation has really brought to the field of education from healthcare. But there are a variety of other approaches. And in many ways, to kind of channel Don Berwick from IHI, it doesn't matter which one you go with, just have one, because it provides structure, tools, and routines to follow, a schedule, a set of examples. And that concreteness, as you're working with data, as you're trying to take that data to do something, is going to be very important. And then the third thing are learning events. So think about these in a traditional professional development context. Think about them as just generic regular meetings with your project members. But these events are key locations for people to share information, to build trust, to play with the improvement method. But it's important to think about these and be very strategic in how they're structured, what their goals are, and what the group will do with their time together. And then a data sharing infrastructure. Again, in this way of being researchers and then practitioners being separated in different organizations, how are we going to move data across our groups? And not just the technical infrastructure, but the processes and the norms. So how are we going to treat one another's data? And then how are we going to ensure that we're doing that and keeping up with those standards? So what does the process look like? So there's like 5 kind of keywords that we clue into, where we want to prepare, understand, explore, co-develop, and test. So we want to clarify why we're working together in the new tech or in the high-tech high case. We want to understand where are there a bunch of different ideas and frameworks and experiences from the front line that we can bring to our questions. And then the explore phase. This is where we want to jointly develop and interpret our data products. This is where we want to pass some information and data across to get a sense of the system, and we'll talk about some other purposes for that. And all this is in the service of co-developing changes and ultimately testing them. So this measurement for improvement is in the middle of the project, so to speak, where it's not going to do anything by itself. A regression will not do anything, but it can help us think about change ideas, and it can help us think about the tests that we want to run on those changes. So in phase 3, when we're thinking about exploring data and doing it jointly, there's some really wonderful research from John Behrens and Tukey and others who've really tried to bring some rigor to this idea of exploratory data analysis, where we're trying to build rich mental models of a phenomenon being examined. And in an improvement case, that is ultimately the system we're trying to improve. So can we think broadly about this school? Can we think broadly about this university? But then also the very specific kinds of changes that we might want to make. And it's about generating questions and hypotheses. It's about developing evidence to take the action. You know, improvement is about building psychological will. So can we develop some evidence that from prior students, from prior experiences, that this might be a good thing and that's worthwhile for you to try? And then in a more modern context, we have this idea of like tools for supporting action, dashboards, algorithms, recommender systems, where we can use the data from a prior, that has been previously collected and actually use that to help us take an improvement. It in and of itself is a change idea. And importantly, we have, again, researchers and practitioners coming together, so can we jointly interpret these data? So how do we best integrate knowledge from research and practice, both in how we interpret what we see and then also in developing those change ideas? And ultimately, this interpretation, where these take place in the form of learning events, are ultimately supporting capacity building. And so one of the roles that a researcher can do in working with practitioners is thinking about the presentation and the analysis of data as an instructional opportunity, putting in sample dummy data sets that help people get their heads around both the analysis and then the thinking of the researcher in terms of work examples and other ways to help the group as best as possible make sense out of the data that has been collected and analyzed. And all this then fits into this idea of confirmatory data analysis. So going back to the EDA approach, the CDA, we want to test some well-specified change ideas, and measurement can help us set those up. And that comes in later on in terms of developing those changes together and then testing them out. And there's a bunch of really useful tools in this. Alicia pointed out run charts and control charts and planned experiments, all of which can help us understand whether or not the changes that we've made that were informed from a data analysis are leading to improvement. And the idea here is that exploratory data analysis is useful, confirmatory data analysis has another use, and importantly, it's this idea of you got to leave your desk to learn. So you're not going to confirm anything until you have put a stake in the ground and tested it in real-world settings. And ultimately, that is the payoff for any kind of data-intensive research, whether big data or small data, in the sense of what changes did it inspire, and then how did we measure the outcomes of those changes. So with that, we have 13 minutes for questions. And I also think that Tim from SRI had another brief announcement to make as well. So Tim, I don't know if you want to do that now, or if we want to turn to questions from the group.
Sure. I just wanted to, put a little context around everything that was presented. Thank you both so much. This is really helpful, and I think there's a lot of relationships to the work that's being done through the Includes launch pilots right now. And I think some really key nuggets that I just wanted to highlight for those who have been present that can apply to some of the alliance building that I know everyone's working towards over the next 12 months. I think, Andy, your point about the 4 keys, the trust, the improvement method, learning events, and data sharing infrastructure, those are all really important elements of partnership that I think launch pilots could really benefit from thinking about as they go to form these alliances and think about measures and the improvements they're making and their intended high leverage problems that they're addressing. And so I would encourage a lot of the launch pilots to think about those 4 key elements. And then, Alicia covered a lot about understanding variation in performance. And this is something I think a lot of launch pilots can really take advantage of, because so much of the work is being done in such various settings and contexts. And I think capturing the variation in performance is important. And I would also encourage a lot of the launch pilots, while they're building these alliances, to think about what are the unique factors of each of their settings and contexts as well, so that they can reflect on, perhaps pushing the envelope a little bit further about, there's this variation in performance, can we get at the why between sites? Both that measurement within a certain organization, and also measurement between these organizations, and a lot of that variation is really important. So with that, I don't want to eat up too much time, but I think this is all really great for the launch pilots thinking about moving into alliances, and I now want to open it up for questions for the next 10 minutes or so. So please feel free to unmute yourselves and jump in with any questions you may have. Okay. Well, if nobody has questions right now, I do want to encourage everybody to go to the website if they have watched the webinar and questions pop up later as you're starting to speak with some of your projects or your partners. Please do feel free to submit questions through our through the Contact Us page on our website. And I did just want to ask Alicia one question about Project Zero. And if that 9th grade, if you saw what was done, or there was an attempt to sort of scale your measure to a different grade. So there was that measurement at 9th grade, and was there any will to move that measure for 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade, and if so, were there any marked differences in the effectiveness of the intervention?
It's an interesting question. So in improvement, we generally sort of start at the level that we have confidence in the change ideas, and then we scale up. So they could have, they could have done that. They ended up not focusing on spreading that change to the other grade levels for a host of reasons. But the one that is interesting is if you go back to what I was telling you about this chronic absenteeism bundle. And if you remember, I told you it was a letter, that one of the things that you got was a letter home to the families after 5 absences. And they had tested that in the high school, and it had worked well and whatnot. And then one of the middle schools picked it up. So the middle school was now going to test it. And one of the things that they learned, and still even though it's been, tested in one environment, the next school would test it because you have a different local context. You have to understand how your local context interacts with that intervention. And what they found, they had sent it home to a small number of students, and then they had followed up, like you do, with parents to say, hey, how did you experience that? And the middle school parents experienced the letter as very harsh. And they were actually very surprised because it's a very student-centered school, and they were used to getting very student-centered type of, or what that felt like to them, student-centered letters home. But in the middle school context, it was sort of harsh. And they realized that they needed to adapt the language of the letter and the way it was framed to middle school parents. And those are really important adaptations for them to learn is how to have, so the concept of notifying parents in a supportive way stayed the same, but for middle school parents, because it was a different grade level and they were used to a different, maybe even because they were used to a different kind of school communication, they had to adapt that to their local needs. So that's one of the reasons that even as we spread things, we try to replicate them, we're also very attentive to local context. And that's useful learning because now the other middle school students might, they know A, to pay attention to that and to test that, and also they might have some clues about how to solve that in the new context. So yeah, I'm sure that your question around the homework in the Project Zero probably would have had the same thing, right? So maybe it's different for 9th graders versus 10th graders versus 11th graders. But the thing I think is really interesting is that in improvement, you're totally recognizing that improvement's not free. So you're being very strategic about where you dedicate your improvement resources. And measurement's really not free. So where do you dedicate your measurement resources? So you're constantly deciding what's the highest leverage area for me to work and working on that. And for them, after Project Zero, they had really, really good learning, but that's not where they focus their improvement efforts.
Great, thank you. So does anyone on the phone have any questions?
Even if it's not questions, I would just like to hear how this sort of bounces off y'all's experiences, the data, even what you're thinking about in terms of like, oh, this is impossible, or that would be useful, or I mean, just where your heads are at.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question, I think, that came up from many folks I spoke with at the PI meeting, was this idea of network improvement and community improvement measures and evaluation. So is this, or are these types of measures something that could be applied for an evaluation? I know evaluating these launch pilots is a very difficult thing given the short window of time. So from your perspective, is this an approach to evaluation, summative or formative, or would you say this is kind of a different beast and more for internal consumption? I think it'd be great to get your thoughts on that. I know it was a common question that I received among launch PIs.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a take on it, but
yeah, why don't you kick us off?
So I guess I think that if you built a measurement system that was good for improvement, if you had your theory and you built a measurement system that was good for improvement, you would also therefore have the measures that were useful for you for evaluation. However, I think if you built a measurement system that was designed for evaluation, you would find yourself in a position where you had the insufficient measures to help you guide the improvement. So I think, yes, I think you could do, I think the danger is in, I think, you know, we have finite measurement energies, and you have to sort of decide where you're going to dedicate your measurement energies, and not to think that, oh, if I just develop the right measures, then all of a sudden I'll have the stuff for improvement.
Mm-hmm.
So we do, you know, in the EDA college program, we collect a lot of measurement for improvement, and we can also then, but we think in advance of some of these things, we also can do something like a propensity score matching to see whether the intervention is really effective. There's a moment in time when that's useful, and there's a moment in time when that's not useful, right? So when the first high school is trying to figure out how do I solve this problem in my local context, I don't know that you need a full evaluation frame, but you do kind of want to know over time if doing these things together, like, is that leading to an improvement? That's an important question around how are we getting things. So I do think there's a time for evaluation, and I think, yes, you'll have, I think you should probably think about, like, well, what would I need to, you know, we're after our aim, so what would I need to know to believe that I got to the aim, and you need to think about that stuff in advance so that it would spit out the stuff you need for evaluation. I don't know if you agree, Andy.
Yeah, I think the idea of if you're doing the improvement stuff well, you can still get at the evaluation question, but not vice versa, is a useful way of thinking about it, because, like, in the operationalization of that outcome or aim through a driver diagram, for example, like, often that is a really high-valued, useful, sometimes even accountability measure, the types of things that have purchased to an evaluation funder, to an external community. And so thinking about them kind of running in parallel, as I think was the case in the pathway, improvement was happening as well as evaluation. The question with the evaluation is always, though, if you're going to let the improvement happen, that needs to be a part of your evaluation plan. Because I think a lot of folks come with this pre-post, do what we tell you, and we might measure some things and we want to capture might of what has happened. Implementation fidelity is different than improvement. You might be measuring similar things, but in the improvement context, you're trying to intervene on it as it's happening. And you need to have that sort of baked into your claims that you're making around the evaluation. So I think the Venn diagram can be highly overlapping if you start with improvement and really think about operationalizing those measures. But the opposite is not true. And then when you're making those claims of the evaluation, just always kind of attending to the fact that we let people purposefully modify, change the intervention over time. Like, that's an important part of that claim that you're going to make.
It's funny, it made me think, I was reading just the other day, I ran my control trial on text messages to students' families when they were chronically absent. So I did the same thing. And the thing that made me sad about it, and they found out it didn't work, so long story short, so it didn't have an impact. But the thing that made me sad about it is how long that took, right? Like, did you really need a randomized control trial? Yeah, maybe that was the best way. And in some cases, a randomized control trial is absolutely the best way to learn whether the change is improvement. But I always like to think about, like, okay, what's the question I'm trying to answer, and what's the fastest way I can answer it? So could they have learned that by trying it in one school and seeing if it worked? Maybe. Maybe this was the best way to convince them they had done that, and now they need the randomized control trial. But to me, it's always like, what's the method you need at what time, and what's the quickest way you can learn your way into improvement? And going too far to an evaluation, like too early, can sometimes, you know, means you have to lock down an intervention. And if you're not it's not time to lock down the intervention, then it might not be time to do the evaluation.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. So I know we're running up on the hour, and just want to reach out one more time to see if anyone has any comments or questions they'd like to share with the group. There's a little bit going on in the chat as well if people want to take a look through. And thank you, Alicia, for the reference as well. And I also appreciate you pointing out Alicia's book, Learning to Improve. I think if people are really interested in pursuing this idea of network improvement communities, that's certainly a must-read. So thank you for putting that in the chat as well. Is there anyone else who would like to ask anything or say anything before we wrap up? Great. Well, I just want to thank Andy and Alicia one last time. Really appreciate it. And if you do have any questions, folks, please feel free to enter them through our contact us page on our website. That's includecenter.org.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Tim, for moderating, and thanks, Alicia, for taking the time. And thank you all for also taking the time and joining us today.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.